I love the name.
It's a bit of a curate's egg. I think like those who get it are like, yeah, cool, and a whole swathes of other people are just like, I don't know how to pronounce that. That's a terrible name. So
don't you get any criticism for bad taste?
No, fortunately we haven't, but maybe we need to get to that stage. I think that's maybe the next step for the podcast to piss people off. We do have some criticisms of like the logo, that they're like, people are sick of Berlusconi staring them in the face, but I think we have to.
I think the fact that every few weeks it seems to be like, oh, I feel everything feels like 1990s Italy seems to be proving a point.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That guy won't go away, but now we've got our own here.
Right, that's exactly it. 90s Italy foretells all our futures. Hi there, this is Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Welcome to new listeners who joined us in the past month or so. Just going to take a quick moment to explain what we're all about, so bear with us if you're a regular listener. I'm Alex Hochuli and I'm the anchor and one of the 4 co-producers. I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil, as is Ben Fogel, another of the producers. The other 2, George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe, are in the UK. What we do here is explore the contours of what we call the end of history. This weird moment where politics seems to have come back after decades of stultifying consensus politics, but in which it takes strange new forms. Our episodes alternate between examining big ideas, the concrete national politics of different societies, so see our recent episodes on Nigeria or a little while back on the Philippines, and cultural discussions such as the Oscars and cancel culture. If you like what we're doing, consider chipping in a few currency units to our Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast. We also accept that very modern form of currency, reviews and word of mouth, so please do give us some gold stars and tell your friends. Now, speaking of currency units, the Anglophone left has moved from the margins to the cusp of power in the US and in the UK. Now that relative success, I say relative at least in comparison to the past decades, is partly due to the appeal of policies such as Green New Deal or a Guaranteed Jobs Act. See, for example, our recent episode with James Medway, the former advisor to the UK's Shadow Chancellor. For decades, the right dismissed any attempt to break with neoliberalism or pursue social democratic policies as fiscally irresponsible. The usual response from the right is, how can you pay for these things? What we're going to discuss today is modern monetary theory. Its adherents, which include people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, claim that they found the answer to the question of restoring growth and paying for the left's big policy proposals. An answer that seems to break with neoliberal dogma. However, there are a lot of skeptics of this idea, and that includes today's guest, the author, journalist and economist Doug Henwood, the author of a recent polemic against modern monetary theory, or MMT, in the latest edition of Jacobin. The link is in the show notes along with other readings. So this week we delve into the case against MMT and why the left should be wary of embracing its proposals. Lest you think we at Alpha Bunga Bunga are anti-MMT and that's a policy position of ours or anything like that, this is actually the first part of a 2-part series on MMT. The next one will see us talk to an MMT proponent to hear out the case in favor of it, and then we will discuss and unpick all the tensions and contradictions in each position at the end of it, as we tend to do. Alright, here is myself and Ben Fogel talking to Doug Henwood. Alright, hi Doug, welcome again. We are coming to you from the failed fascist state of Brazil, where things are getting seriously weird. I say failed fascist state, it's not a failed state which is fascist, it's just failing to become a fascist state, and is actually being held down by the usual immobilism of Brazil. So it's pretty weird, but let's talk about the United States rather than Brazil. Doug, amidst the collapse of Russiagate, which I think we're all very happy to see, and the beginning of the eternal campaign season, how are you feeling about Bernie, to get us started?
Well, I like Bernie a lot. He's had, I like him, what he proposes to do, but also his effect on American politics has been almost nothing but good. He's inspired a whole cohort of young people to become socialists, or at least profess to be. A whole bunch of candidates inspired by him have been running for office and actually won in many cases. And I know he revealed this taste for a radical politics, whatever precisely that means in practice, but at least in name, among a very sizable portion of the population of the age of 40. So it's remarkable. This guy is almost twice that age, is inspiring all these young people to embrace a politics that hasn't been seen in this country at least since the 60s or maybe the 30s. So it's nothing but good. And, what he proposes to do is has a pretty simple agenda, but Medicare for all would be a wonderful thing. College tuition, free college tuition, rudiments of a more civilized welfare state. He's sort of not so great on foreign policy, although he's been getting better. But these would be by the standards of American politics, which are pretty low standards. It's such a breath of fresh air and such an inspiration. So. I just worry that a lot of people are hoping that the magic he performed the first time around can be repeated easily the second time around, and maybe not. No, it's a bit of old news now, and everybody's trying to imitate his agenda while watering it down. So it's not going to be the same as it was in 2016 when he was the only person challenging the discredited embodiment of the status quo. He's got there must be 27 or 43, or I don't know how many people are running for the Democratic nomination for president now, but it's a bizarre and crowded field.
Is Beto already a person, though?
That's doubtful, and Buttigieg too. Whatever's how you ever pronounce that. He seems like kind of a bot himself. I was just reading his college essay on the Dave Matthews Band after 9/11. It was just quite a piece of work. And I know he's only 19, but still, there's no excuse for that.
Absolutely.
I have to apologize on behalf of South Africa for Dave Matthews. He went to the same school as my father, actually.
Oh, he's South African?
Indeed.
Ben's constantly surprising me with people who happen to turn out to be South African. I'm like, well, that's a different angle to them I hadn't seen, but there you go.
Oh, yeah, my condolences. But, he came out of Charlottesville in the U.S., and I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, so I always feel tainted somehow by that association myself. Oh,
speaking of that, Doug, we've been big fans of your show for quite some time, and we think you're one of the best interviewers out there. But from what I understand, your formation was actually in English literature. How does a literary type make the transition to commenting about the world of high finance?
Well, I was when I was in college, I was divided between being an economics major and an English major. And when I first got to college, I had this brief period of mental illness, I would think, and I became a right-winger, libertarian of the Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek sort. And while I was in the grips of that, I was going to be an economics major. Yale at the time was a real hotbed of Keynesianism, so I felt like I was really going against the grain by being a frank reactionary. There weren't very many of us in the early 70s. It was a very lonely thing to do. But then I just got disillusioned with the right and threw the economics over it. I thought I'd be romantic and impractical and be an English major. And I just loved romantic poetry and critical theory. And then I went to graduate school and studied those things too. I was going to write a dissertation on Narcissism in American poetry, Emerson, Whitman, and Stevens. And I was going to tie that to the evolution of the political economy. I stayed interested in economics, even though I didn't major in it and didn't pursue any more study of it. And I started reading up on, I read Baron and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital, and started reading all this Marxist economics. And this is much more interesting than the evolution of American poetry. So I just got more and more into that and then started writing about it. Back in 1986, I launched my newsletter, Left Business Observer, and really just, as the development economists say, learned by doing. But I did do some undergraduate economics, but only 5 or 6 semesters worth of it. So it was all mostly self-taught.
Well, I'm sure all our listeners will be avid readers and familiar with all your work. but we maybe should actually talk about maybe the narcissism of the American economy. I don't know if we can put that heading to it, but I mean, everything in the UK, in the US economy, seems to be discussed in reference to internal US elections, and that includes both inside the US and outside. So maybe we should actually talk about the economy itself. Obviously, the top line figures look okay, and the US can still pretend to call itself a job creation machine. But of course, we know that the unemployment figures disguise quite a lot. So beyond the media discussion of the economy, what state is the U.S. economy actually in? And I guess if we have to ask the question, how does this play in the elections?
Well, by conventional measures, given the numbers on income growth and unemployment, Trump should be a shoo-in for re-election. Although we're a while away from the actual election, so anything could happen over the next year. But American elections are actually very, very predictable. You can predict them with a high degree of accuracy with just two variables in the spring before the election. That is the president's approval rating and the growth in real per capita income. And the growth in real per capita income, while not gangbusters, is looking pretty good, but the president's approval rating is very low. So that just by those conventional measures, Trump is not a shoo-in. But it's a very weird economy we're living in now. Nothing seems to be behaving as the textbooks would suggest. You should see with the unemployment rate now just below 4%. We should be seeing wage growth and signs of increasing worker militance. We are seeing some signs of increasing worker militance, but that's so far it's mostly in the public sector. Teachers, we've seen a few private sector strikes, but labor is still a little livelier than it was a couple of years ago, so not showing any great signs of strength. The fact that wages are not rising very rapidly is strange. There's just not a whole lot of satisfaction. People don't, the popular mood is not that of a prosperous country. And we've been seeing this incredible froth in the financial markets for several years now, just booming markets. Bond market's been stumbling a bit, but the stock market has been doing mostly well for almost 10 years. And usually when that happens, there's a general, kind of outbreak of euphoria and good feeling. When it happened in the late 90s, it was, you could see it in pop music. You could see it in the broad culture that there was just this euphoria around, even because the money was being spread around more evenly. Everyone across the income distribution, the wage distribution, was seeing real wage increases for the last few years of the 90s.
But I guess nowadays
you
get this endless redefinition of expectations downwards. So, what good looks like is not exactly what good looked like in the 90s or for that matter, the 70s or before, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I think people have just come to expect nothing, especially for younger people. I mean, I was just looking at some of the numbers for younger people, and it's not as dire as it was as a few years ago. But the unemployment rate for younger people is higher now than it was in the late 90s, even though the broader unemployment rate is very low. And a lot of people are up to their ears in debt. So, while things are certainly better than they were in 2008 or 2010, this is, not happy days here again time.
So let's get down to the brass tacks of what we really want to get into here, which is the question of MMT. Ben.
So for those who don't know, MMT is modern monetary theory and is seemingly all the rage from Brazil to the United States to its real homeland, in my opinion, Australia. Even politicians like AOC have been bringing it up in terms of the big debates at the time, a Green New Deal, what does democratic socialism look like? So, Doug, how did you come to write this article?
Well, first I ever heard of it was I met Stephanie Kelton, who was one of the originators of the theory. A paper she wrote in 1998 is considered one of the founding documents of the school. I met her when she was in graduate school at the New School here in New York at a party, and she said she was working on showing that the government didn't need to tax or borrow to spend. And I said, wait, really? Are you serious? And she said, yeah. And I thought, I was in the presence of a lunatic and went and got another drink. Little did I know that 20 years later, this thing would be all the rage. And a few years ago, I started hearing more and more about it. Friends of mine, one friend of mine who was in a Marxist feminist reading group in Brooklyn said everybody was talking about it there. A lot of the DSA people were talking about it. It was just spreading around on the left, more the softer left, not the real. You're not going to find Trotskyist groups talking about it, but I think a lot of people on the softer social democratic left and liberals found this a very engaging doctrine, because the question always is, when you propose something ambitious, something like Medicare for all or a Green New Deal, how are you going to pay for it? Which is a legitimate question, although it's often used cynically to shut things down. But how you're going to pay for something is an important question. But the temptation of modern monetary theory is to say, well, I don't really have to pay for things. The government can just write checks, print money. The metaphor they always use is keystrokes, that money is just created by the government out of thin air by tapping on a computer keyboard.
Right, and you're quite sarcastic about this in your article, constantly, very often referring to keystrokes as just magicking progress out of thin air, which I think is
Yeah, I think the theory well, let me say this. It's kind of hard to talk about modern monetary theory in any rigorous way, because they're so slippery about defining it. So if you look at some of the cornerstone doctrines, that you don't need to tax or borrow to spend, that's under American law, that's just not true. The government cannot spend money that it hasn't either gotten through borrowing or taxation. The Treasury cannot borrow directly from the Federal Reserve, which is what in their fantasy world, they seem to think you can do. They always say things like, "Oh, we're just describing the world as it is, not as we want it to be," but in fact, it's not. But I think they would like the law to be changed so the Treasury could just borrow from the central bank and spend money out of thin air.
But it does start from the central proposition, right? That what creates money is not the central bank, but actually private banks and responding to demand for credit, right? And I guess that's what.
No. This MMT came out of that school of thought. That's endogenous money theory, which is kind of a branch of post-Keynesian economics. And that held, under like classic monetarist doctrine, Milton Friedman et al., the central bank creates money and then it spreads through the private economy. And then you have the risk that, as they say, too much money chasing too few goods, you get inflation. And that's the Milton Friedman didn't like that. But they then endogenous money theory, which is, I found, rather persuasive and has a lot in common with Marx's theories of money, for that matter, holds that money is created when private banks create credit, lend money to private actors, businesses or consumers, which then they scramble to fund somehow, that they make a loan first without necessarily having the money on hand. And then usually the central bank will accommodate that, providing the money to cover these loans, unless they're getting into a tightening mode, and they won't do that. But in modern monetary theory, the origin of money is when the government spends money.
So just to come in here, I'm just going to quote from your article about the relation of government to the market. And this is from someone else speaking. Government is a god, giving economic life through spending. Until it spends, we have no money. Taxes and borrowing are merely means to manage the levels of reserves in the banking system. This seems like a compelling break with sort of neoliberalism and the haunting specter of inflation.
Yeah, well, then, see, this is what I was saying earlier. They're very slippery. So if you say, well, if the government just spends without limit, that will create inflation. And they say, oh, no, we don't believe in doing that. We don't believe in taxing to raise revenue, as most people think of taxation. We believe in taxing to control inflation. So we remove spending power from the economy, and that will soften the inflationary impact of all that spending. And then we will just go happily onwards by having drained liquidity from the system, drained reserves from the banking system. Awful lot of MNT is just this boring accounting around bank reserves, which is just like the dullest thing on earth, but they're very technocratic about that sort of thing. So then, as they drain money out of the system, and then we don't have to worry about inflation anymore. So then you ask them, at what point does that happen? They're very vague about that. what are the limits on spending? Well, we don't know. We'll just spend until something happens. I mean, they sound like the old Mark Zuckerberg, push it till it breaks kind of view of things. But again, they're really very vague about precisely how loose they think the constraints on spending can be.
In terms of interest rates, when I see MMT stuff, they propose basically a 0% interest rate. I mean, what is exactly their policy in terms of interest rates?
That's what they say, at least from the central bank policy rate, but here in the United States it's the federal funds rate. And they think that interest rates can be zero forever, basically, which, as far as I can tell, is incompatible with the capitalist system, although they profess not to be opponents of the capitalist system. Wray, one of their gurus, has said that MMT is compatible with any kind of economics you can imagine, from social democratic to Austrian libertarian. But they do believe that somehow the central bank can keep interest rates at zero forever. That means it's a mystery to me how things would work under that kind of arrangement. Who would lend money to whom under those circumstances? That's just beyond me. But they say these things, and people say, "Really?" And they say, "Yeah." I don't know. It seems fanciful and fictitious to me.
So in your article, I mean, you're very clear about how unconvincing a lot of MMT proponents actually seem, how flaky a lot of their answers are when they pushed, and so on. And I think we can take that all on board and say, okay, fine. But if we actually get down to the economics of the matter, I mean, do you find that there's any validity to their proposals? In your article, you seem to hint that, well, if they're just saying that we don't need to be so worried about the deficit and we can print a little bit of money, the state can lead investment a little bit more, that's kind of all right. I mean, do you go along with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell sometimes where they're just sort of like somewhat kinky Keynesians, or they actually believe that the government can spend without limit. It's really hard to tell. So sometimes they just say, sometimes it's just, well, in a recession, the government can spend money and get us out of the recession, or the government can borrow and make long-term investments. We needn't worry so much about the deficit within reason. Those are all fairly reasonable. I mean, you could argue about the levels and the long-term impact, or you could argue about whether the government, the budget should be balanced over the long term. These are all, open questions, but these are not unreasonable things. But it's really hard to tell how far they want to push it, because sometimes they just sound like regular old Keynesians with perhaps a kink, but at other times they're off in their own world. I think, as Kelton said once, MMT is a brand, and I think a lot of it is a brand rather than some sort of intellectually rigorous school of thought.
Let's talk about the brand then. So who are the main brand leaders, the influencers in MMT? What sort of influence do they hold? Can you sort of give us a very brief genealogy of MMT for our listeners who are probably mostly unfamiliar with it? And I believe in the article, at least, you hint to even some crossovers with the genealogy of neoliberalism in terms of its history.
Well, the founding documents of the school are, as I mentioned, Stephanie Kelton's paper earlier from 1998, and Randy Wray, who had a book, Modern Monetary Theory, first edition, came out in 98. The kind of that Vatican of MMT thinking is the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Several of the people either were there or passed through there. Wray was there for a long time. Kelton was there. Pallina Tcherneva, who is a younger person who works heavily on the job guarantee, which is part of MMT, was there. And then also the Levy Institute at Bard College is another outpost of theirs. At first I thought it was a very American doctrine. It seems to me very dependent upon the imperial privilege the United States has by issuing the world's currency, the dollar. We don't have to worry about the foreign exchange value of our currency at all. We've been able to borrow without limit as we like for as long as anyone can remember. But apparently it's actually there are places around the world where it's picking up. I just learned from you that it's big in Brazil, and I really don't understand how precisely that would work, given that the Brazilian currency is not widely accepted internationally. Brazilian government bonds are not as good as U.S. Treasury bonds, so I really don't know how they propose to get away with it.
So actually, now that you mention it, we were going to discuss this in a little bit, but might as well jump into it right here. I mean, obviously, inflation's the big concern, and in an emerging market like Brazil, let alone in lesser developed markets, that seems to be a real problem. How open are MMTers about the fact that this really only applies to certain developed economies, especially to the US? You know, the question of monetary sovereignty, okay, that's clear if you're the US and some other places. You mentioned Canada, Japan, Britain. But, you know, if you're Brazil, that's a lot less straightforward.
I just wanted to come in here quickly. I think MMTers are actually saying, in terms of what I've seen in places like Brazil and South Africa, that it's completely applicable to Brazil and South Africa, and this is a great idea to get the economies growing in developing nations too.
Yeah, I really don't understand the logic of that at all. There's quite an amazing exchange, which I wrote about in the article, between Tom Palley, who is a post-Keynesian economist based in Washington, and Warren Mosler, who is an interesting figure in MMT land. Warren Mosler runs a hedge fund, lives in the U.S. Virgin Islands because it's a tax shelter with nice weather. He has subsidized. He writes his own books, writes his own blog, but he also writes checks to support MMT research. He's given, I think, something in the order of $10 million to the UMKC people. He subsidized their journals. He subsidizes their conferences, and it's very interesting that they have this guy who lives in a tax shelter, and he pays them money to write about how the government really doesn't need to tax. It's a curious coincidence of personal want and intellectual doctrine. But there was an exchange between Mosler and Tom Palley at a conference in South Africa, and Palley is, I think, originally from Zimbabwe. And has followed the economy of Southern Africa pretty closely ever since. And he said that Mosler was talking about the job guarantee, which is, I guess we'll talk about that in a bit, but the idea that the central government will guarantee anyone who wants to work a job. And the rate of pay is controversial. Some MMTers propose a pretty high rate of pay. Mosler himself, being a hedge fund guy, proposes a pretty low rate of pay. But the principle is that the government would provide the unemployed with a job, and presumably one paying better than somewhere above poverty wages. So there's this exchange between Mosler and Palley said, well, if we did that in South Africa, if you gave all this money to the poor people, they would want electricity and food and things that are beyond the current capacity of the South African economy to produce. So you would have very serious inflation problems just because the productive capacity of the South African economy couldn't really handle all this new demand if we gave it gave poor people that kind of money. Mosler defended himself by saying, well, he didn't want to give them that much money, so it wouldn't make that big a difference. So, what is the point of the job guarantee? But then Randy Wray took this exchange and caricatured it in a paper responding to a critique that Palley wrote of MMT, saying that that Palley doesn't want poor people to be able to eat, which is not the point he was trying to make. He was trying to say that you have to really take seriously the productive constraints for a poor country like South Africa. Brazil, of course, less poor, but it does have productive constraints compared to a country like the United States. So I don't understand how, in the absence of a really, advanced high-tech production sector, you could just spend money with printing presses and hope to develop the economy that way. They're very scornful of foreign borrowing, for example, for developing countries.
Yeah, and you're very clear about the difficulties of actually acquiring capital goods, without borrowing. You need to import, how do you put it, like locomotives and nuclear power plants and whatever. You can't just magic that out of thin air.
Yeah, and to do that, you need dollars and euros and yen. You don't, because that's the companies that make those things are based in the first world countries, then they want hard money to pay for the goods. And it's very hard. You can't, how do you pronounce the Brazilian currency? Real or real? Yeah, my Portuguese is terrible.
No, it's good. It's good.
You can't pay for, like German machine tools with reals. The Germans want euros for that. Same thing, South African rand. You need to borrow in those currencies if you want to buy advanced productive goods. Now, you could probably, push the boundaries a little bit by printing money and maybe, give poor people a little extra. But then if you start creating inflation, you're going to create a whole lot of political tensions as well between middle-income people who see these poor folks getting money and the price of their goods rising. And so there's going to be a lot of internal struggle over this kind of funny money finance. But they really don't want to talk about these kinds of productive constraints in any serious way. And in the United States, if we used printed money, if we just created money out of thin air, MMT style, to fund a Green New Deal, we don't produce that much in the way of solar panels. We couldn't build high-speed rail, would have to import that. So it wouldn't even stimulate that much in the way of employment in this country. It would probably stimulate employment in China and Germany. But it wouldn't do so much here. But they don't really talk about that. Right. Yeah, I just want to make. I think one of the most striking things about this doctrine is that they really separate the relation of money and the productive sector to a very extreme degree. In most of the time, you think of money as a way of facilitating private exchange. It's all about goods and services, labor, buying and selling things, and that's what money is all about. It's the great universal equivalent in Marxian doctrine. But no, to them, it's just something that the government creates, like God giving life to Adam.
Yeah, and I mean, you put it very clearly, that division between sort of money and ignorance of actual production. To return a little bit to the case of emerging economies, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the problems of money chasing not enough economic activity. As a sort of thought experiment, and to try to make a case for how MMT might work, could one imagine under an authoritarian government, I guess, with enough control over production in an emerging economy, which would be able to actually create enough economic activity and drive that investment towards productive ends? Sort of a mid-century mid-century South Korea, for example. I don't know. Would that be a situation which MMT might work?
Well, no. South Korea did it with exports, and the government had a very, very heavy hand of planning. But monetary.
Well, that's what I'm kind of getting at. I mean, would you need a very firm-handed government which controlled a huge swathes of the economy to be able to make all that printed money actually get to work? Rather than
absolutely, but they're not really interested in altering the productive sector very much. They never talk about that sort of thing. They're not, and they certainly don't talk about class relations, like 0% interest rates. The investing class would not take that lying down. So sometimes, under the guise of these moderate sounding proposals, they're actually proposing something that would require immense political mobilization to make happen. Keynes talked about the euthanasia of the rentier, and the rentiers would fight back. They have armies. They don't like money being taken away from them.
That brings me to sort of a central thing I've always found with sort of MMT types. They're very kind of strangely apolitical. It's kind of like a technocratic doctrine that promises all the benefits for redistributive policy with none of the trade-offs, none of the confrontations and mobilizations that you would need to put the investor class in its place.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, there's nothing about class that you can see anywhere in their literature. And I read a lot of it. That's one of the reasons it took me. I first started talking to Bhaskar Sankara about writing this piece on MMT. I don't know, 2 years ago or more. And I put it off because I didn't want to have to read all their literature. I'd read enough of it to know that it was really repetitive and boring and not very enlightening. And so I finally decided, okay, this thing is out of control. Everybody's talking about it. I must launch my salvo. But it was the absolute indifference to class is very, very striking. And, that comes out in the job guarantee as well. I mean, it comes out in both ends of the class spectrum, the lower end of the working class and also the upper classes that would not take kindly to having their wealth inflated away.
So that we're going to come back to the jobs guarantee in a second, but one of the other weak points which you identify in terms of MFT is taxation policy. And you sort of make the argument in the article that we as socialists in our limited capacity in today's world need to focus on taxation as it entails some sort of class-based confrontation or limiting the power of the ruling class and so forth. How does taxation play in a sort of socialist fiscal strategy?
Well, I think, in this grim time we live in, where in the U.S., socialism has a salience and a prestige it hasn't had in a long time, but this is unusual in the world, and it's very unusual for the U.S. to be leading the way in this area. But in any case, that the idea that to me, taxation is a kind of socialization of resources. We're taking money away from upper income people, but I think we need to be honest that, and this point got edited out of my article from Jacobin. But if we want anything like a developed welfare state in the United States, everyone is going to have to be taxed more. People at the 50th percentile, people at the 70th percentile, and certainly people, 90 and above, absolutely. But when you start taxing people at the very, very high end, they're going to stop paying each other so much. So how much of that money would evaporate when you try to seize it is a question, but you can certainly get some of it. There are a couple of academic papers that show that the ideal top tax rate is somewhere around 70%. That maximizes the revenue and sort of gets on top of all the avoidance strategies that rich people might have. But that since they don't really think about the relation of money and to the world of production and all the social relations around the world of production, their view of taxation is extremely technocratic. It's just a way of removing liquidity from the economy if things get a little too hot. But to me, taking money away from a private consumption, the sphere of private consumption, and putting that towards public use, that's a kind of fiscal politics with a socialist intent. So, for example, the example I give examples I give in the article is fewer Lamborghinis and more bullet trains. Fewer Hamptons beach houses and more public housing. So we want to take money away from rich people so that the money they spend can't be doesn't hog up the resources. They could be used for more public-spirited pursuits. But since they only view taxation as a very shallow way, Wray has said, and others have said as well, that taxing rich people, we don't want to tax them to use their revenue, use that revenue for any kind of good public spending. In other words, you can't say tax the rich to feed hungry kids and save the planet. No, that's bad. They talk about just taking their money away because they're too rich, which, I don't know, it seems to me much better politics to say tax the rich and spend the money on saving the earth and feeding poor kids than it does to say, let's just take their money and burn it.
Yeah, and that's a good line about the bullet trains. And I think it's a certain irony that a lot of, I guess, left liberal discourse, which is more focused on justice than on what kind of society you actually want to build, also uses taxes in a way which is a bit of a throwaway. Well, it'll just harmonize things or it'll make society fairer rather than actually thinking what you want to do with it. And I guess MMT seems like, well, look, you've got all this unlimited cash that you could spend, but it also fails to ask what you actually want to spend it on and what kind of production do you want.
Yeah, I quote Joan Robinson a couple of places in there where she says, she was criticizing what the vulgarizations of Keynes, but even Keynes himself to some degree, who famously said he'd rather people just dig holes and fill them back up again as a way of creating jobs than just let unemployment stay high. And I can understand where he's coming from, but on the other hand, there really needs to be some thought about what we're spending money on. A lot of liberal discourse just thinks of jack up the deficit, stimulate the economy, and don't really think about the structure of that economy or what is being produced, what is being consumed, how sustainable is it over the long term. There's not so much interest in that, and MMT also suffers from that. There's really not much interest in reshaping the world of production, or certainly not the world of social relations, the ownership and control and boss and worker and all those sorts of things. Not much interest in those things at all.
Right, and that comes very clear. That comes through very clearly in your critique. One other really hot idea in the world of political economy, of course, is UBI, and one thing which is associated with MMT, which is a jobs guarantee, which you've already mentioned, seems to be potentially a little bit more appealing than a UBI, than universal basic income. But like with UBI, where you can have a bad UBI, which is just an excuse to cut welfare and public services and keep people on a pittance, you can also have a more progressive version of UBI. I'm personally skeptical, but one can imagine such a thing. Likewise with the jobs guarantee, I think we probably also have to get into the nitty gritty and actually examine what does this jobs guarantee look like? And what are you actually producing? Are you just having people dig holes? So maybe you could talk us through a little bit about whether you're sympathetic at all to a jobs guarantee and under what form.
I go back and forth in this, and I can't really make up my mind. I feel somewhat that way about UBI. I mean, there are things I find appealing about a UBI. On the other hand, I think there are real political limitations to the popularity of paying healthy people to do nothing. I think for people who have to, are working, there's going to be a lot of resentment of paying people to do nothing. On the other hand, work sucks, and I can understand the appeal of wanting to get away from it. So, I have mixed feelings about that. A job guarantee avoids that problem of paying people, the political problem of paying people to do nothing. But in the proposals that the MMT people have come up with, what they want the job guarantee to do is not all that inspiring necessarily. They make, and Pavlina Tcherneva, who's written several papers on this, is their leading job guarantee person. And in her paper, she argues that the wage should be about $15 an hour, which is something like the 35th or 36th percentile of the American wage distribution. So it would not be a strictly low wage employment. It would also come with full benefits, health and sick benefits and all kinds of things like that. And by their estimate, it would maybe be about 2% of GDP. I don't know if that's exact, but it would not be extremely too expensive to do a job guarantee of that sort. But they say, she and her colleagues say very explicitly that do not want to compete with the private sector. Why, I don't know, but they say they do not want to compete with the private sector. And they also shy away from any kind of the ambitious New Deal style proposals, infrastructure spending in particular. So the WPA in the 1930s produced roads and dams and post offices and schools. The U.S. is still living on the infrastructure that was created 80 years ago during that period. My friends Dick Walker and Gray Brescian, who run this Living New Deal project out of Berkeley, have been mapping all these WPA things and other New Deal projects around the country. And most people had no idea, even until they started doing this, of just how extensive that infrastructure building was. They don't want to do that. And in a period where American infrastructure is literally falling to pieces, where bridges collapse all the time, just basic stuff like that, but also where we want to think about creating a whole new green infrastructure to do what we can to stave off the horrors of climate change. There's not much they have to say about that. So they're interested in kinds of things like planting trees and cleaning up trash in yards, and there's a lot of some people might think of as make work, and these are not pointless tasks, but
and if it's temporary, it can be justified, right?
Yeah, but the other thing is, they also talk about care work, and I completely agree with this part of the analysis, that care work is mostly done by women, and because of that, it is disparaged, and it is that the big infrastructure projects are usually done by male labor, and that has more prestige. And I can understand his critique completely, and I'm sympathetic to it. But on the other hand, there's no reason that care work couldn't be revalued. It doesn't have to be paid poorly and treated as almost as an afterthought. And there's no reason that women couldn't do this kind of infrastructure work either. So the idea that this building things is purely gendered male seems to be just holding over something that's very obsolete from the past. But these are urgently needed tasks, and the having a transient workforce, people who are unemployed or having trouble getting jobs otherwise, doing this kind of labor just doesn't seem like you're giving it a whole lot of social value. It seems like some friends of mine think of this as workfare schemes, and there are aspects of workfare about it that we really need to develop a clean infrastructure. We need to have climate mitigation stuff. Building seawalls, all kinds of things to prevent the inundation of our coastline. That's very serious stuff. But they're not really interested in doing that. But these things could in theory create pretty high wage jobs, could generate whole new industries, and save the planet at the same time. But that's not what their job guarantee is about. For them, it's just part of a business cycle management scheme.
Right, absolutely. I think we can be sympathetic to a jobs guarantee and try to think through what a good one might look like. As you say, there's a lot of useful things to be done in the economy which currently aren't remunerated and which should be done, in fact.
And it means stepping on the private sector. That to do these things right, we need to step on the private sector's freedom of investment, which is, for the bourgeoisie, that's a big deal. And so it requires serious political mobilization to get any of these sorts of things done. The other strange political weirdness about MMT and the job guarantee is that anything that eliminated the sting of unemployment would be viewed by the employing class as a threat. If the boss can't hold the threat of unemployment over the working class, then bad attitudes will develop. Labor discipline will soften. And they seem not to care very much about the implications of that, about the political implications of that. And also having a job guarantee at a $15 an hour wage, which, as I said, was something around the 35th or 36th percentile of the American wage distribution, that would drive up the private sector wages by a fairly large amount, which would be a good thing. I'm all for it, but I don't think they really fully understand how disruptive that might be to the whole structure of the labor market, whole structure of the class structure of the American economy, which depends heavily on really low wage and transient and desperate labor. So they're proposing something that would require a great challenge to bourgeois power. At the same time, they seem not to be contemplating on how to mobilize to get there.
Right. So you end up mistrusting its proponents and therefore mistrusting their prescriptions as a consequence. I agree that it looks like you need to be taken a lot more seriously in terms of actually breaking eggs. But their whole doctrine seems to be, we don't need to break any eggs. We can just do what we want.
There's a way which is the easy way out. But they also don't seem to have thought about it very much.
Yeah, no, that's concerning, and I think we'll have to take this discussion forward in other podcasts and so on. Just to finish up, we do need to talk about fiscal responsibility, I guess. Would you call yourself a fiscally responsible socialist? What does that mean? We actually just had James Medway on recently, a couple of weeks ago, and he was pushing this line as well. And of course, in that regard, MMT does have something going for it, which is that it's not a deficit hawk. So, where do you position yourself?
Well, I said on Twitter a while back that I consider myself a sound money socialist, which I meant half as a joke. But the MMT people had great fun with this. But what I meant by that was that you really have to think about how you're going to pay for things over the long term. You can't just conjure money out of the air and think you're going to make the world better. You have to think about how you're going to reorganize production and how you're going to channel resources into making that better world. And that means figuring out how you're going to pay for it. It means expropriating, essentially, the resources that are now put to malign use in the purely private sector and putting them to benign use in the public. And this idea, and I'm certainly not saying, you need to balance the budget all the time and tighten belts. And I don't want to sound like Wolfgang Schäuble, but over the long term, I think you really do have to pay for things. And MMT seems to avoid thinking about that. So that's what I mean by calling myself a sound money socialist. I think you really need to be serious about how you're going to pay for stuff and not just dismiss the question with a hand wave.
Right. And indeed, probably would be good to establish exactly what the limits of an MMT style approach would be. And I think you're very clear about this, that they are unclear. Your interlocutors are unclear on what exactly the limits of printing money actually is. Do you want to print a little bit of money in certain determinate circumstances, or do you want to do it always? And I guess, as if we're thinking seriously about socialist strategy, the question then would be, how do you position yourself exactly between sort of deficit hawks, with also just thinking you can just tax the rich without confrontation, or that you can print money without confrontation, and actually being serious about what that confrontation would involve and where you want to go with it.
Yeah, and I think the MMT is avoiding all those hard questions and all those political challenges that would be necessary to get from here to a better place.
All right, excellent. I think we'll have to call you up again maybe at some time if you're up for that to actually discuss some more of these hard questions. But for now, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Doug.
Give me a call anytime. Thank you.
All right, that's it for this program. We're back in 2 weeks with more. Just one final announcement. Bunga is off to California next month to record a series of programs on the Californian ideology, wellness, mindfulness, high-tech Silicon Valley shit. That's courtesy of the University of California Irvine's research group, States of Wellness, which is funded by the School of Humanities there. We're very excited about that. We'll have a hell of a lot of content coming out, unpicking various aspects of the Californian ideology. So all that to look forward to. Catch you later. Bye-bye.